be here, and thanks for joining us. We have two amazing panelists. You've heard about their experience. I want to say a little bit about Corey first. You've heard that she's the CEO of Culture Banks, as a digital news platform creating a stock market-driven, focus on that stock market-driven business news to the hip-hop music culture, focused on the African-American market. But initially, she was an investment banker, an ex-investment banker, an ex-TV producer for Bloomberg and CNBC, and an ex-news anchor on the floor of New York Stock Exchange. So an investment banker, TV producer, news anchor on the stock exchange is only fitting that she had the mission of getting the right information to the right people, and hence she has a cultural banks focused on the audience that she wants to pass on the right information focused on business news. Thanks, Corey, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And you've heard about Ronnie, who came here from Ghana with $3,000 and successfully built against all the challenge, successful tech company, and exited at $40 million. Now he's paying it forward so that the next generation of African youth don't have to go through what he has gone through, but providing them gainful employment through tech and creative works wherever they are. And he's on target to create 100,000, not 1,000, but 100,000 creative work for the African youth. So to start, why are you too bullish about the African talent? And what are you doing about it? And what is your why? And what are you doing about it? Why are you bullish about the African talent?
So Africa is amazing. Just for anyone in the room who has not actually been to the continent and like stepped foot there, you just need to go. And it seems like everything just aligns and falls into place and makes sense, right? When you hear others talk about it, you're like, oh, wait, I get it. Like, this is what I've been missing by not coming to Africa. Specifically, for me, like, why is Africa so important? Why is the storytelling, the narrative building, right, around what's going on in Africa, the investment, the tech, the entrepreneurs, the people? It's because there's not enough of it being told in a way that highlights the opportunity and the growth. And this is where companies like mine, Culture Banks, come into play to be able to make those type of connections, and even working on the government side. I think we're going to talk about that later, and things that I've done with them. But Africa, if you are working with a company or brand and whatever your businesses are, and they don't have a strategy and a plan for Africa, they are absolutely missing the mark.
Thank you very much. And your work at Culture Banks, how does it affect, or how does it bring this opportunity to the market? And what are you doing to that opportunity?
Yeah, so we tell stories specifically through our Culture Banks International section that is hyper-focused on Africa, on the business side of things that are happening in Africa, and also on the entrepreneurs, which I could talk about a little bit later, some entrepreneurs that we featured, not just on Culture Banks, but through some of our media partners like Forbes and like the NASDAQ. But I'll turn it over to Ronnie.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having me. So, came here with $3,000. Ended up getting lucky and, building a company that exited for $40 million. It was a hotel software company. It was called Stay in Touch. It was based in Bethesda. The funny thing about it was, like, we exited in 2017, and by all, like, everybody's standards, I should have been elated and super happy because, it's you're broke and now you have something, and you should be overjoyed. But I felt this, like, profound sadness, and I wasn't sure what it was. And I remember, like, one question that was just ringing in my head consistently, and it was, how do you want to be remembered when you die? Right? And so I kept thinking about it, and I was sad, and I kept thinking, like, well, how do I want to be remembered when I die? And I knew that I didn't want to be remembered as the guy that built a hotel software company and made some money. But I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then one day I thought, whatever I do, I knew one thing. I wanted to build another company, but the company I built had to have an impact on people's lives, right? It couldn't be just about making money. It had to be about making an impact as well. And still didn't know what it was. And then I remember seeing this crazy stat that said by 2050, the number of young people entering the workforce in Africa would be more than all the young people entering the workforce in the entire globe combined. And it blew my mind. It was a crazy, crazy amount of growth. And I knew that no matter what I did, I knew I had to build a company in the context of that growth. I launched it with 2 co-founders in 2018 to connect talent from Africa, specifically creative talent with companies in the US. And now we have about 50 big enterprise customers, about 20 of the Fortune 500 that hire creative talent from Africa. And the biggest thing about that is it's making a real impact in people's lives.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Ronnie. So let me drill a little bit on that side. So you're providing opportunity for the talent, the creative talent in Africa. But on the other side, you're also providing amazing talent to the companies who are hiring those talents here in the US. So it goes along with also the storytelling and amplifying of those success stories. Can you tell us any success story, maybe your clients really enjoying the creative work of your talent you brought them from Africa? Anything you can mention?
Yeah, I'll talk about like a local company here everybody has heard of probably, ARP, right? So they were one of our first enterprise customers. And I was talking to Kian Henry about our creative talent. And she's a black woman, she's a boss, she's a badass. And she was like, I don't care if they're from Africa, I don't care if like they're black, like I want to make sure that they do great work. And I was like, that's exactly what we vet for. We make sure everybody's excellent. That's what we focus on. It's not charity. We know that they're great. And so then she hired some creative. She hired Sei from Nigeria and Lisa from South Africa. And she loved them so much. She said that they're her secret weapon, her superpower. And a year later, she ended up getting promoted to EVP, and she said that was one of the reasons, like working with those 2 creatives was one of the reasons she got promoted, because they were able to design such beautiful and clear communications for her. And at the same time, Lisa was able to buy a house in South Africa because of the work she was doing with ARP. So it was amazing on both fronts.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing those success stories. And the more those success stories are shared, well, we can really see the amazing tech talent in the right way. So that's really great. Corey, let me go back to you. You are in the media space. And how does tech diversity look like in the US? And how does it compare with tech diversity in Africa? What is your observation?
So there is some overlap. Obviously, the investment level is not the same. And if I just throw out a few quick stats for everyone to help us contextualize, right, and really picture what this looks like. If we take a look at all of 22 for last year, there were about 633 African startups that raised $3.3 billion. In Q1 of last year, African American startups in the US raised about $1.2 billion, which is still less than a percentage point of the entire venture capital ecosystem. But if I'm comparing that to just African Americans in the US versus the entire continent, right, of Africa, that's why I like to kind of throw those numbers out to people to let us know that the investment is happening, but there's more, right, that can be done. There are some similarities, however, there's still a long, long way to go. When you think about what we do as entrepreneurs here in the US, as Black entrepreneurs, and the way that we think about getting access to capital, those same lanes are not necessarily always open to African startups on the continent. And I think the lovely host asked before we came up here, like, what were the top 4 countries for, investment in startups in Africa? And what was not mentioned in that, though, as well, is that a lot of those startups that are getting some of the big investment dollars, which are some of the bigger name companies that we've all kind of heard of, like the Jumias and things of that nature, those are not even companies that are started by like actually local Africans on the continent. And so those are also things to consider and to keep in terms of the broader narrative and the storytelling about when you see these big numbers coming out of Africa and African startups, to really keep that, in the back of your mind and say, okay, but let me compare that as well to, is this actually, to your point, helping the actual African people and the companies that they're building? Are they getting the same access to capital that some of these other much bigger kind of, and let me just say this too, most of the investment in African startups tend to be in fintech companies as well. But are they getting the same access, the local African people who are creating these companies, or are they just kind of being sidelined to only employee status at these different organizations?
Thank you very much. And it is a very important topic, as well as when we started the African FinTech Summit in 2018, that was one of the areas we want to address. Making sure that the local talent, the local startup is supported and invested in, but also you need to tell the story. The investing world need to discover it. So at the time, the US investment to Africa was negligible. Most of the investment used to come from Europe. Down the line, we have twice a year our summit here in DC every April, and we go to one African city. We do a lot of weekly newsletter, storytelling, profiling investment opportunities. Now, 2021, 2022, 78% of the investment is going from the US. But most importantly, you can break down those investment by sector, by gender, by country, by founder. So those data points will help the investment world, and then the angle can be either justified or challenged. So that's really important. Ronnie, when you talk about diversity, we're not only necessarily talking about the front end, we can go to the back end as well. So I know you talk about diversity in design. What is the concept of diversity in design, and why is it important?
Well, I'll talk a little bit about creativity and design for those that interact with creative, and whether you're on social media or podcasts, you interact with everything that's been designed, right? But we're in a very interesting time when it comes to creative work. So there's more creative work now, like by a factor of like 100, than there has been at any time in history. So even if you go back like maybe 30 years, you got billboards, people create creative work there, TV, some things on the internet early. But now you have like hundreds of channels, right? So people are creating things in podcasts and audiobooks and VR and AR and 100 social media channels. And so that means that these companies feel like there is something going wrong. And I've coined a term called we're in a creative crisis. And what that means is this. So because there's so much work, the companies that are tasked with all the work, they feel that there's not enough talent to do all of the creative work. And they're loading all the work on a few people that they're used to hiring, right? People from New York or San Francisco or DC. And what that's doing is it's killing creativity. And that's why I said it's a creative crisis, because you're getting too many people trying to design for too many things, and they're just churning and burning, right? And so what I tell these companies, these are big global brands like Colgate and Johnson & Johnson, that we're not short of talent, right? You're not short of people. You just have to look elsewhere. You have to look in the globe. And it's not just diversity because people look different. It's diversity of thought, diversity of ideas, diversity of skill set, right? And that's a key component in creativity, right? And so just letting them know that they can look outside, and we've been helping them kind of see the world in a different light, we feel will unlock kind of one of our most creative periods over the next 10 years. So that's one thing we're super excited about.
Thank you very much. Let's move on to the next question. So we're talking about, collaboration, connectivity between the US and Africa. So yes, at the commercial level, you can connect talent with companies, but policymakers are also involved because we're talking about the continent and the global counterparties. So to have a successful win-win partnership, both from the US or maybe the end user and the African talent, what do you think that policymakers, both here in the US and in Africa, need to do?
Well, let me just say, building companies, relationships between the U.S. and Africa is, still ongoing, and there are challenges, right, in order to be able to carry that out. Earlier this year, I actually went as a delegate with the U.S. Department of State to Accra to have these public-private talks, right, with the president of Ghana, with the different heads of government across Accra to talk about the way that we can build up these relationships, specifically as it relates to Ghana. I mean, that is what is kind of known right now, at least here in the West from the U.S. government perspective, as like the gateway for trade and for business to the rest of Africa. So it's not that it's not happening on the government and on the policy side. It's just that there are a lot of tribulations and challenges to be able to smooth things over. And the trade, specifically when we think about goods and the trade between the US and Africa, that at the end of last year was around $32 billion. While $32 billion is not some small number to sneeze at, if you look at, other countries and other continents around the world that the U.S. is doing trade with, I mean, that's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So 32 billion across the entire continent in terms of trading for goods, that's not that much money. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And I will say that specifically as it relates to Ghana, they are pushing forward and really leaning into what a stronger relationship on the business front would look like with the U.S., not just from a private sector perspective, but also from a government-backed perspective.
Thank you very much, Ronnie.
Talking about Ghana, it reminds me of a company called Andela. So they're one of the companies that have raised a bunch of money and have a multi-billion-dollar valuation. They train tech talent in Africa and then connect them with jobs. And one of my buddies, Sangu, took them to the Ghana government because they wanted to open up some schools there to train folks. And I asked Sangu, how did it go? He was like, Charlie, they embarrassed me. I was like, why? What did they do? It's so I took them there. They're trying to get bribes. They're telling me that this is going to take 1 year to 2 years. It's Nigeria opened it up really quickly. Kenya did, and here we're going through this bullshit bureaucracy, and so they didn't end up opening there. And I say that I think if we talk about policymakers, we can look to two places. And I think if we look at China and India, right, China was one of the poorest places in the world, so is India, and now they've built up a strong middle class. And regardless of how you feel about them, they were able to build it up, and now they're strong economies, right? So if we're thinking about what made them so successful, it's usually two things. One is they were outsourcing, so that means they were taking wealth from developed countries or US and Europe and then putting it into their economy, one. And the second thing, they were investing that money back in education, right? And so that's how you build up the middle class, because then you use the money, you build the education, then you have your own people do that. And so what policymakers have to do is they shouldn't around with people that are investing in those two areas, regardless of where they're from. If it's education and jobs, fast track it, let them come in and educate our youth, put money into the economy, because ultimately that's just going to benefit us long term. So, yeah.
And thank you so much. Just adding to that as well, from the African policymakers' point of view, really looking the African youth, the highly educated, connected, and we're talking about 530 million mobile connections, and next year is going to be 640 million mobile connected. Most of them are the youth, who can use that digital connectivity to serve the global tech creative opportunity. So take them as a competitive advantage that can actually bring a lot of forex income without leaving the country. So that requires maybe effective diaspora policy, effective repatriation policy, tax incentive, looking at the maybe not necessarily doubling the tax for the self-employment. So there's so much. From the US point of view, we can talk about visa issues. For example, you talk about the two employees you mentioned, Lisa from South Africa, needed to come in and fix a creative issue. The next visa appointment is in 2 years. So visa, banking for the global tech employees, that's also very important. Now, last question is a call to action. So we have the students, the diaspora community here who may potentially going back to the continent or doing something as pay forward from here. What is your call to action? What is your advice to the students, to the diaspora community when it comes to seizing this tech creative work opportunity? What is your last word of advice?
Well, I would say actually we've had several interns at culture banks who are from Africa. Some of them have gone back to try to start businesses. We have several different journalists in Africa that are on our team that help to create some of the content. So this is something that's very near and dear to my heart when I hear from the people directly in my company, like, hey, we're going to go back to Cameroon or we're going back to Uganda and, we want to start XYZ business. And I think that's really the main thing. And both of you, I think, alluded to earlier, the population in Africa and the fact that a quarter of the population in the world is going to be African by 2050, and the majority of people in Africa by 2050 are going to be under the age of 25. That is something that can never be stated enough, paid attention to enough, because the opportunities are great there and perhaps much greater than we're going to see in any other continent or across any other continent by the time we get to that level. So my main call to action would be, if this is your calling, if you feel it in your heart, right, to go back to Africa, tap into the future, build the future that you want to see and start building it now, because it is going to be here so quickly. The population in the US is not going to ever rival where Africa is going, and that's what we need to be focused on.
Thank you so much. Ron?
Great. I 100% agree, wholeheartedly. And so Lisa and Say, just to the point before, so they're all remote. And so one of the reasons we created a remote work company, and it's all technology-based, is so that people don't have to leave, like I had to leave, and they can invest back in their communities. So no visa issues there. But from a call to action standpoint, to everybody, it's simple. It's invest in Africa. And when I say invest in Africa, it's not just money. It's about time, right? It's about your expertise. It's about working for African startups. It's about talking about African startups or African countries and companies and educating people, because we have a branding issue sometimes. People think it's charity. But what I tell everybody is that it's the last untapped place in the world. It's the biggest and best investment opportunity that's going to be around for the next 20, 30 years. And you see China doing it, and now the US is trying to catch up. So invest in Africa, and you're going to get more than 100x return while making an impact and changing the world.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.